Hello, everyone. This is Ed Brenegar, and welcome to the Eddy Network Podcast. And the podcast today is going to be me. And I'm going to talk about the podcast, and I'm going to talk about conversation and how that fits into our lives and our work and our relationships. And this is really setting up the future of a book on this that will be the follow-up to Circle of Impact. You know, when I started as a consultant back in the mid-90s, one of the things I first concluded was communication was the number one problem. And communication at that point in time, and probably is the same now, was the delivery of information or the transfer of information from one person to the next. And as a result, not much was communicated, because if you send an email and they didn't respond to the email, well, the sender of the email will think, well, I sent them the information. They should have responded. Well, but that information didn't go as a conversation; it just went as a delivery of information. So there was what developed was an orientation around whoever was the speaker. And the speaker tended to be the person who had the most dynamic personality, or was in the position of, in the hierarchical position of being in charge. And so there was a relationship between speakers and listeners where they were not equal. They were in a kind of form of competition. And one of the things that was really clear to me is that most people sat in a meeting and they weren't listening to learn, they were listening in preparation to speak. Because the whole point of communication was to project your personality, and project your knowledge and your expertise so that you had a greater leverage, you had greater control, greater authority over the group. And this is what I saw, and I still see it today. That hasn't changed very much, because the structures of organizations haven't changed, because if you're in a position of power, then you have the voice. And if you're not in a position of power, you have to find more clever ways to communicate your position on things. So communication serves the institution. This is what I realized. Communication serves the institution, and it does not serve the relationship between people. But this is changing. This is changing. There are people like Chandima, Dutton, and Olaf, Hermans, both who have been guests on the podcast, who are involved in very direct programs to improve the conversation that takes place in organizations. And they're approaching it very differently. And so I think it's worth going back and tracking down Chandima and Olaf's podcast, because I think what they're saying is really very valuable. And they're operating from the position or the perspective of, we need to fix how conversation is done within the institutional structure. That doesn't mean that people don't have good conversations outside the structure, but within the structure, we need to fix that. And so they have a program. They each have a different kind of program, a different approach, different philosophy. And for that reason, they'll be able to meet the needs of certain groups, and other people they won't be able to meet. But the reality is that we have lost the art of conversation. I mean, I don't want to be critical of anyone that's been on my podcast. And I thank them all. I thank all of you, because your willingness to be in conversation with me was one of the bright points of this whole venture that I've been on. But how many times did I hear, I mean, not every week, not every episode, but how many times did I hear, oh, that's a great question. Oh, that's a deep question. As if, oh, I'm so surprised to have someone ask me a question that requires me to have to think at some level of depth. And that's the beauty of what was going on, was that we were having deep conversations, even if we had just met for the first time. I mean, if you go to my YouTube channel at Brenegar, and you will find a playlist of first conversations. And these are all people who were first time in conversation with me. Or it was first time I was in conversation with them. However you want to parse that, that's what was going on. So that we have a problem in how we understand conversation. So I see that there's some failures that we've experienced. And one is the failure to understand context. What is the context of the Eddy Network podcast? What is that context? Well, it's different from every person, because sometimes there's a background context that we share. Sometimes we actually have a relationship and we share that context. Sometimes the context is the learning environment of the guest, and maybe we share that, or maybe we don't, or maybe I'm being invited into their learning context. So context matters, because then we have a place to reflect and to work off of to understand what's going on. There's a serious deficiency in being able to appreciate the other person. If you're having a conversation with people and that person doesn't leave the conversation feel like they have been heard, much, but even more so that they are appreciated for who they are, they've been thanked, and that they feel like they have contributed in a way that really matters. If they're not leaving with that, then something didn't happen that should have happened. And so you're going to laugh about this, but I think for that reason, there needs to be a purpose to the conversation. Now, the purpose doesn't mean that there's a script. Purpose means something that we want to be clear. We want to have a clear conversation. We want to understand each other. And we want to be able to say at the end, that was really great. I really appreciate who you are. I've learned something from you. And thank you. So that's the purpose of the conversation. Not did we solve this problem, or did we plan this next event, which may have been part of what we had to do anyway, but it's really, there's something deeper going on. And that deeper thing is really the human experience that we find in conversation. Obviously, we need to learn how to listen. And so one way to learn how to listen is to sit through an hour-long meeting, say nothing, and write notes on what every person is saying. If you do that, you'll begin to learn how to listen. What maybe you see in what I do with the podcast is I'm listening so that I might identify a question that I could ask that can take our conversation to a deeper level. When we start, we say, who are you? What do you do? Where do you live? Something really generic like that. And it's really up to the guest to say, well, this is who I am, and I live in so-and-so, and I've been doing this, and I have these degrees, and this is what I'm interested in. And this is, and somewhere in that, I find a question to ask. So how long have you been working in engineering? How long have you been doing this? And when did you decide to go back to school and get your PhD? When was that? What was the instigating moment where you realized, I need to go get another PhD? Oh, wow. You see, those questions come not because I come with those questions. Those questions emerge in listening to the guest. And then it's really letting the other person speak. And one of the challenges I have is that my guests have asked me to say more and more, so that we're in a dialogue rather than an interview. And I'm grateful for that, but I also recognize I have to be careful and not say too much. Let my guests be the guest and be the priority. But there have been situations where I've been asked by the guest, can I ask the questions today? I want to ask you questions. And I say, okay, I'm fine with that. But you see, there's dialogue, there's conversation taking place there. And they're asking me questions like I'm asking them questions. And then somewhere in that, I will start asking them questions while I'm saying what I need to say. So let me say this. And I think this idea of having a first conversation is really, really important. I'm getting ready. I'm talking with a local coffee shop tap room to do a weekly Eddy Network Podcast style conversation event. All that's not the name of it, but it'll be something like that. Say on a Monday night, we gather for an hour at 7. We'll have coffee or a beer or something, and I'll, as the kind of facilitator of this, I'll just say, well, tell us something, and and set up parameters, set up boundaries, so that we operate with respect towards one another. And so we just ask, so who are you, and what do you do, and why is that? How did you come? How'd you come to be in that kind of work? And then you say, well, that's really interesting. What is it? Do you like this kind of work? What do you like about it? And so in having that conversation with 5 people or 10 people or something like that, what we're beginning to learn is that everybody's life is their own, and it's something unique, but it's something that we can gain something from. I think a second thing to do when we're having this first conversation is don't compare yourself. Don't sit there and say, oh, well, I've done that, so here's my story to top your story. I think we all do that. I know I do that. I mean, because we all want to share things, because in a certain level, we want to share that my experience is similar to yours. My experience has been parallel to yours. But sometimes that's heard as, well, my experience is better than yours because I'm speaking second and you're speaking first, and I get to talk over you. That's not the way it should be. I think knowing how to ask questions is really, really important, and knowing how to initiate by asking questions. And so if you're, I do this, standing in line. So here's an example. Just this week, I walked into this coffee shop, and I was going to get a glass of tea, and I'm standing there at the counter, and the wait staff is taking care of me. There's a young man there, probably 30, early to mid 30s. His wife is over there dealing with a couple of young children, and we just start talking, and I tell him about the podcast, and he asked some really good questions. So I said, what happens with the podcast, and this is about 5 minutes into our conversation, is exactly what has transpired with us right now. I mean, you and I are now talking at a fairly deep level. It's not superficial conversation. We're now talking about, how does this kind of conversation factor into your life as a salesperson? I said, and would you like some help on that? So he asked my card, maybe he'll contact me. See, that's how these things go. So we're asking questions to learn. We're asking questions to initiate a deeper level of interaction. And I think we also want to recognize that the place that we're having this conversation, whether it's online or it's in a coffee shop or in an office somewhere, but to recognize that as the context for our connection, but not the limitation of our connection. So if I'm talking with someone and I'm on the phone, I'm talking to them in their office, that connection is between the offices, my office and his office. But what I want to do is say, well, let's go get coffee, or let's go get lunch someday, or let's go to a ball game, something like that. We could talk about these things in a more enjoyable environment if we're sitting there watching, minor league baseball team play. So you take the context that exists, and then you move it into a different place, And when you do that, you're changing the dynamics of that relationship, and you're growing it and you're deepening it, and it's becoming broader. And it's a way of taking that first time conversation and building a relationship to it. Three other things that are, really quickly for you. The first thing to recognize is that you and I are people, and we're not just people that do things. We're people that are creating things, and that part of what we're creating is an environment for communication. So one way of looking at it is to see that communication is a dynamic that happens between people. It's just not information being shared. It's just not fulfilling an obligation to share information. It's also actually having the conversation which says, is the information that I'm sharing with you and the form that I'm sharing it by what you expect from me or what you want from me? Maybe we think that text messaging is the way to go because we're comfortable doing that. But maybe the person that we're talking to, that we're trying to do some work with, doesn't like text messaging. They'd rather have an email. It has a different stream to it, has a different feel to it. So I think it's really important that we think about how I am the communicator and how they are a communicator, and how we're exchanging these bits of information so that we are not just transactioning information business, but we're also encountering each other in a personal way so that there is a transformational aspect to it. So the interpersonal communication in the context of an office or in the context of a team, I mean, these are the things that Chandima and Olaf are focused on, and I think it's worth knowing them. And I will link to their episodes in the show notes. I think the last thing I want to say, and this is a big topic, and it'll be a topic with that'll go in this book. And you're getting a beginning look-see at what the book is to recognize that all that we do is a form of leadership. It may be good leadership or it may be inadequate leadership, but it's a form of leadership, because anytime we take initiative, we're going to create something. We're going to cause something to happen. It may not be what we want, but it is what it is. So I think it's important that we think about our relationships with one another, and how in our outreach to one another, in our initiation towards one another, we're actually also functioning in a leadership way. And the other day on one of the calls I was on, I mean, we talked about this in the context of the relationship between leaders and followers. And the idea is that I think the old idea is that there are leaders and there are followers, and there's just a few leaders and there are a whole lot of followers, and the followers are following the leaders, and those are kind of static relationships. And I don't think that's exactly right at all. In fact, if you take this set of ideas that I've described here about communication and conversation and who we are, what I'm really saying is that we are all leaders because we take personal initiative to create impact. And we're also all followers because we're listening and communicating and seeking to be in relationship with other people who are also leading. So we're following by listening and following by contributing in a way that we have been invited to contribute, for example. And so we're always leading and we're always following, and it's not always clear. And in the same group, I mean, the same team meeting, we could both be leading and following. And so leading and following is no longer these discrete things that are kind of hardened and, like I'm only a follower, I'm only a leader. No, they're just There's just ways of being the same person who is being very um, adaptable in the context of what you're doing. And the adaptability is not, oh, I'm going to adapt for an hour because so-and-so is running it. No, the adaptability comes in the moment of decision. Oh, I'm listening. So I've been adapting by listening to what someone is saying. And all of a sudden, well, I have a question I'm going to ask. So I'm going to raise my hand, or I'm going to step forward and I'm going to ask that question. So when I'm asking that question, I'm taking personal initiative to answer a question that may have an impact that we all want. I hope that's not too confusing, but that you see, I see this idea of us being leaders and followers as things that we're doing simultaneously. And if you think of yourself as both the leader and the follower, then you begin to see that the dynamics of our lives and the dynamics of the relationships we have and the dynamics of what transpires in the groups that we're in is far more significant than what we are used to seeing because of the structures of organizations where everything's kind of defined, everything's scripted, everything's in a silo, everything's in a box, everything's in some kind of lateral enclosure. What I'm saying is I think this is changing. And I think when you see yourself as both leading and following at the same point in time, but you're both speaking and listening, you're both asking questions and answering questions, you're doing all these things at the same time because the dynamic of you as a person and the dynamic of the situation as a place and a time is that it calls upon us to be different. It calls on us to fulfill the potential that we have. So that's why I see what I'm doing with the podcast is really significant, and I'm looking for ways to take that experience, which is virtual to a large extent, take that experience and take it outside of the virtual nature and put it into something that's direct. So this conversation I'm having with the coffee shop is one of those ways of doing it. I'm going to offer coaching for people who need to do a better job at talking. They need to learn how to talk. They need to learn to be in conversation. And and by the end of the summer, I will have a coaching program set up for that. In the meantime, what I'm also going to do is I'm going to, in a sense, take the podcast on hiatus. I have 8 or 10 interviews still in the can. Still, I've recorded but haven't processed. And so what I'm going to do is begin to show the podcast episodes only on Thursdays, beginning this week. So the next one in line will post on Thursday. This is posting on Monday, but this will be the last one that posts on Monday, and we'll begin to do these all on Thursdays. And I think this will take me into late August or early September. And I'm not at this point, I'm not planning to do any more interviews between now and the end of August. But if that changes, then I may end up having episodes all the way through the end of September. And then we'll see where it's going. I think that I need help in doing this. I need to generate some income. So part of this is figure out, well, do I start a Patreon page? Do I go look for people to sponsor, companies to sponsor? I just don't know. That's those are things that are not in my talent skill set at this point, but I'm going to have to learn how to do that. So all of those things are possibilities. So if you know people that you think I should be interviewing, then introduce me by email. Take my email, ed@edbrenegar.com, and send us both an email saying, Georgia or Fred, Ed's got a podcast I think you ought to be on. And then from there, I'll just take it from there, and I will set up a time when we can have that interview. I'd love to do that. I'm particularly looking for people in the arts and music industries I've interviewed a young man who is a PhD candidate in piano performance. I've interviewed a friend of mine who um, teaches at the North Carolina School of the Arts here in Winston-Salem, and his expertise is in theory of music theory, history of music theory, and boy, that's so far beyond me. It's incredible. We have a really great conversation that'll be coming up soon. But he also is the music director at my church, and so his he's revolutionized that experience. It's not like church you've ever been to, and it's not like mega churches. It's not like the old traditional. It's a mixture. I mean, I just left church, and the piano player there was playing something similar to what I would have heard. Um, if I was last night, I was at the Blue Note in New York. You know, something very much a jazz, but very contemporary and not very normal. And then it goes into a hymn structure, which is normal. So it's an amazing thing. So that's one of the people. I have another conductor that I want to interview. We're trying to figure out a time. I mean, so I'm interested in people who are performers, and I'm interested in talking with them about art as something that is fundamental to the future of our society. And so painters, people, architects, these are kinds of people that I'm interested in because they talk about beauty and they can talk about our sensory experience of beauty and how that can build relationships between people and strengthen community. So those are the sort of people I'm interested in. So if you know of someone, please introduce me to them, and we'll figure out a time for an interview. I want to thank you for watching and thank you for sharing. I want to thank each of you that make comments, and they really do matter. It helps me have a sense of what resonates, and increasingly more and more people are commenting, which I'm very pleased with. So I thank you. I thank you all for being a part of this venture, and we'll see where it goes. And if you have other thoughts, leave them in the comments, because I really do appreciate what you have to say. So until next time I feel like it's time to say something directly to you, I will see you on the next episode of the Eddy Network Podcast. Now, thank you very much, and goodbye.